Hey guys, I'm Charles Neal. I've been a woodworker, professional woodworker, for almost 40 years. And you know, through that course of time, you learn a thing or two. We have filmed a ton of DVDs, videos, YouTubes, written books on finishing and so forth, so on. But this DVD is a little different. This is the one where all of that we filmed, we're going to show you exactly how we do it and what we use. That's not to say that there's not other ways and there's not alternatives. But having done it professionally, as well as having a lot of friends who are professional woodworkers, you learn a thing or two. The other thing with woodworking is you have to understand is it's inherently dangerous. I mean, that's just a given. I can tell you all about how dangerous it is. See my left hand? That's a table saw. Was I stupid? Well, maybe. Did I make a mistake? Maybe. What were they? Well, in my case, trying to make a living, I'd been up over 48 hours straight working, going wide open. And I, bottom line, just flat fell asleep over top of a table saw, over a big Powermatic 66. I was very fortunate in the fact I didn't have the blade too high above what I was cutting, but I still did a lot of damage. But the other thing with woodworking is not only is it dangerous, but it's expensive, or can be. So one of the things we definitely want to look at and we want you to take note of is, you know, I'll guarantee you we've thrown away twice as many tools as we have. Why? They didn't work very well, ineffective, inefficient. You know, if you go out here and look around in the woodworking world, it's just a huge mass of gadgets, gizmos, and things like that. Some work, some don't. But again, the way we do it is what has worked for us all of these years. The same with a lot of our professional woodworkers and a lot of the hobby people who have followed us. The procedures and techniques just work. Safety is your number one priority. There's one common rule, and don't forget this if you don't learn anything else. If it feels unsafe to you, it is. It's that simple. You know, as we go through this, we're going to talk about table saws and routers and direction of feed and understanding things. But the bottom line to it is no matter what you do, if you have a fear of it, it's dangerous. Don't seem safe, it's not safe. I can't hammer that home enough. The other thing with woodworking is it's a progression. If you're a new woodworker, then, you know, you've got to go through the steps. There's skills to be developed. In modern day, those skills take time. They take patience. Everybody in here tells me that I am probably one of the most impatient people there are, except when it comes to my woodworking. Because I've learned, if you're not, you're going to have issues. You just, you know, you can only go so fast and not make mistakes. But you're still going to make mistakes. You know, a lot of times the only difference in the professionals and the amateurs, we just know how to hide our mistakes and get out of trouble easier. And I'm real good at that, both getting in trouble and I'm pretty good at getting out. But back to the safety thing. You know, you're going to see whether you're using a push stick that you made, one that you purchased, other ones you can purchase, you know, safety glasses, shields. You just can't be too safe. It's just, again, that's going to be the main priority. Nothing in woodworking is worth getting hurt over. But we want to show you how to avoid that as well. One of the first places we want to start is if you're going to do woodworking, the number one place to start outside of safety is with wood. You got to understand wood. You know, that's the medium by which we're going to create things. All right, so If you're going to do woodworking, one of the first things you have to do is you have to learn how to pick your wood. And that can be easier said than done. I personally prefer to go to a mill and pick my own material. But I'm also fortunate in that through the years, I've developed relationships with different mills and whatever, so I'll buy it and have it shipped in. But again, you got to be careful with that. Go out, check the reputations, how long these people have been around, and so forth, so on. But also remember something. You've got to be able, when you're buying hardwood lumber, you've got to be able to speak the language a little bit. By that, what I mean is that when you're buying lumber, they're going to refer to something as a 4/4. 4/4 basically means it's an inch thick. 8/4, 2 inches, 12/4, 3 inches, etc. Now, when it's sold, unless you have them surface it for you, then it's going to be sold in the rough. I mean, it's going to look like this. Not very attractive. You're going to have this old hard, nasty looking surface on it. You're going to see all the saw marks and everything else. And if you have provisions to be able to surface it, meaning you have a joiner, you have a planer, then you're fine. If you don't, then you maybe need to have them surface it for you. Now, when you go to ordering and you go to talking about surfacing, a couple things you need to remember. The terms, the language. If you want it surfaced top and bottom, then you want a S2S. It's exactly what it means, surface two sides. If you want them to surface two sides and joint one edge, then you want an S3S. And then, of course, you've got the S4S, which means they joint one edge and then they straight line rip the other. If you don't have a planer and whatever, that's what you're going to have done. But through the years, one of the things that we've learned, we have a term called sneak up on it. And basically what that means is you don't go to a final dimension or a final size until the last minute. It's never failed me. If I need a 3/4 inch piece of wood, for example, I'm going to skim plane it just enough to knock the crust, if you will, off. Now, even though it's kiln dried and everything, everybody seems to think that's an end all. It's not. Let me explain. If we would compare kiln drying to a loaf of bread, if you bake a loaf of bread or cake or whatever the case, you want a nice crust on the outside, but it's going to be, while it's done, it's still going to be moist on the inside. That's exactly what we do not want in wood. But irrespective, when they kiln dry it, it has a tendency to form a little bit of a crust. Now, if you take the same loaf of bread and you peel the crust off and you set it out on the counter, what happens? It dries out. I know there's a lot of you out there, your mama has threatened to slap you good if you didn't close that bread up. Why? If you don't, it's going to dry out. Exactly. Well, in this case, I hope you don't get smacked, but when it comes to wood, it needs to be opened up and let dry out. Therefore, we skim plane it just enough to take the crust off, and then we let it do what we call acclimate. Now, we do not go down to a final dimension. Here's some 8/4 maple right here that's going to become bedpost. And you can still see there's saw marks in it and whatever. We just barely knocked the crust off. And we've let it sit around and acclimate, setting that loaf of bread on the counter and letting it dry. Now we've flipped it, flopped it. This is pretty much ready to go. Here's a stack of walnut, exact same thing. Now, when we go to put this into a project, then we'll do our final dimensioning. The reason for that is because wood's going to move as it dries out. So if I take this down to an absolute final and that wood moves a little bit, I have nowhere to go. By keeping it as thick as possible, I can then, if it moves around on me, I can come back and recover. If you're buying figured woods, here I've got a piece of flame birch, this is a piece of curly maple or tiger maple. Here's another piece, here's a piece of cherry, some more tiger maple. Here's a piece of poplar, kind of rough. You see the brown right here? Odds are when I plane this, that brown is either going to stay a little brown, but oftentimes it'll go green. And you can kind of spot the green in poplar. We use poplar a lot for secondary woods. You know, making backs or making drawer sides or whatever the case. Also use a lot of white maple. I like the white maple. It machines well. But I also like it because when I'm doing drawers, which you'll see, it lets those dovetails show through really nice. It also makes for a natural finish. It makes for a clean, nice white interior. One of my favorite woods. If you're looking for figured maple or figured wood, now when I say figured, if you look at this piece of cherry right here, unless you're buying curly cherry, and curly cherry is a different animal from a curly maple or a flame birch. Let me grab a piece. Curly cherry, by and large, has a figure similar to flame birch. The difference is curly cherry typically is not. It has larger bands of curl in it, figure in it. Now, the flame birch can also have larger bands. You see the curls running up and down through this one. The difference is, in the finishing, you would use a dye on the flame birch to bring all that curl out. If you do that on the curly cherry, it just turns into a dark mess. So it's a difference in the cell structure between the hard and the soft grain. But here's the point. If you take this piece of cherry in the rough, you can see, now this has been skimmed a little bit, you can see the figure. If you look at this piece of maple right here, on the bottom of it, the mill's written curl. They're telling me this is curly. I can see some curl running down the edges here, up the side. But if you look at the one right beside it, let's get a real good close-up right in here. If you look at the one right here beside it, you can see the curl, very dominant. Okay. One of my tricks when I go to a mill picking lumber is I'm going to carry me a little block plane. And if I have a question about what I got because it's rough, then I'm going to hand plane a little bit to see my curl. The other thing you want to watch for when you're doing it, when you're picking lumber, is if you look right here, can you see this streak? That's called sticker stain. What is that? If you look, when they kiln dried this material, they put other pieces of wood in between the board so air could flow around it. And depending upon what they used, that piece of wood, which is called a sticker, can stain your piece of wood. Take a hand plane, skim it off a little bit, make sure it's not going very deep. Sometimes, no matter what you do, you're going to have those sticker stains all the way through it. So that's something to watch for. But here's the key. This piece of cherry, I've got a seasoning check running down right here. Now, just so you know, in woodworking, you never call it a crack, it's called a check. I didn't invent that. But I've got a relatively wide piece here, and from here to here, I've got a nice clean board. I don't see any sap on the edges. And in cherry, that's something you need to be aware of. Cherry, sapwood is not considered a defect. But it's white and the cherry's red. So if you're wanting a nice even color, the best thing you can do is look for a cherry that's at least red one face. I'm going to go for red two face. I'm going to pay more for it. But one of the things I've learned is that trying to get rid of the sap or color it in, by the time I figure time, labor, and material to do that, I'm better off to buy the better material. That's just been my experience. Now, by the same token, if I'm buying poplar, depending upon what I'm doing, I may buy some what's called one common. One common's going to have some knots in it, have a few defects in it, but it's going to be a whole lot cheaper. But unless I'm doing something, here's an 8-foot board, unless I'm doing something I need a full 8 foot, I can cut that out. Saves you a lot of money. You know, if we can swing the camera over here, here's a bunch of white maple right here. And some of it is a list. I'm 6 foot tall, so this is not quite 6, and then there's some 6 in here and there's some 8. But I got the 6 foot stuff at a pretty good price because it wasn't 8 foot long. But it's going to become drawers and stuff like that. So, you know, it's fine. But in the same token, if I was building, some of this is going into face frames for kitchen cabinets. Well, how many places do I need, 8 foot material? On the other hand, you see the 8 foot stuff. Some of these face frames are going to be 42 inches long. So that 6 foot material is just going to give me a lot of waste. I cut 42 inches out of it, I've got a 20-inch piece. Now, that would then translate over to some of my drawers. If I have an 8 foot piece, I can get two 42-inch pieces out of it, far less waste. You're also going to notice that these are kind of narrow in here. Again, they're going to become drawers and face frames. But my face frames on this particular set of cabinets is 1.5 inches. So I tried to pick my wood, 3.5, 4 inches to give me room to cut that straight, or I try to get wider than 6. I can get 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches. But I can't, but I gotta think about something. When I go ripping that stuff, what's gonna happen? Wood likes to move. When you saw a piece of wood, you're removing stress. You're relaxing the wood. And you've all cut a piece of wood on a table saw and see it go this way or see it pinch. Well, the piece of wood that comes off is not going to be perfectly straight. So we have to have a little bit of room to come back and straighten it up. So when you're buying your wood, think about your width. Now, I rarely buy wood. Now you got to listen to me close on this one. I rarely buy wood based on a specific project. Meaning, I don't go out and say, okay, I'm going to get this, this, and this out of this. Or this, and this out of that. I try to buy some extra, and I try to have wood little bit of extra to back me up. Mistakes happen. But when you're doing it, pay attention to what you're looking for. You take this piece of curly maple right here. I've got a bark inclusion on the top corner. But that's how it is. You're not going to buy rough cut lumber like it comes from a box store. You know, the box store lumber is an entirely different animal. Most of it's hemlock and fir and spruce and pine and all that. And ironically, that's where most woodworkers start their woodworking, is buying that. What they don't know is that's some of the nastiest stuff in the world and some of the hardest to work with. You know, if you're a beginning woodworker and you want to get a good wood to work with, start out with some poplar. You need a planer. A planer is a pretty important thing to have. We're going to come back in a moment and we're going to plane a little bit of wood and we're going to talk about planers. Okay. Let's talk about planing wood. You know, most people's opinion, it's kind of stick it in a planer, out it comes. It's a little bit more to it than that. One of the things, now my planer here is a 20-inch Powermatic with a helical head. Now what's a helical head? Helical head, and I'll show you on the joiner in a little bit, the helical head is a series of carbide knives set on the cutter head, and they kind of twist around a spiral, if you will. They're probably one of the best when it comes to planing anything. You get less tear out, less chip out, and they leave a much smoother surface. The other nice thing about them is that they typically have 4 sides, and again, I'll show you more, and you can simply rotate them in the head and you can replace them. So each little insert has 4 sharp edges. But I would imagine most of you have what they call a lunchbox planer, which is a small benchtop planer. You know, I used them for years, and I'm gonna be honest with you, they do a really nice job. One of the reasons I liked them so well, the only issue I had with them was the width. But they did a nice job. And one of the reasons was they didn't really have those big, heavy in-feed, out-feed rollers. Most of them had a rubber roller that brought the wood through and whatever. And most of them did not have bed rollers. Now what's a bed roller? Well, up under here, which you can't see, there's rollers in there. And the rollers are designed for the wood to travel through on. Now, nowadays, most of your wood is band mill sawn. What that means is just think of a big bandsaw turned sideways, and that's the way they saw it. The reason for that is that the band mills don't remove as much kerf, so they get a better yield. But a lot of wood is still sometimes often what's called circle mill cut. And you've seen it, great, big, huge, round saw blades. Now, again, with them, you know, a lot of times the kerf in that thing was 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch. So they lost a lot of wood. So the band mill is far more efficient in yield. Now, if we look at this piece of flame birch right here, you can see the circle marks. Can we get in close enough to see them? I think. Coming just like this. If we look at this piece right here, you can see the stripes, see this going across it. This is band mill cut. And if you run your hand up it, it's got a little bit of a washboard to it. Now, the problem with that is if you have those bed rollers, as it goes across it, and that's going to translate into your cut surface. The circle mill, not so bad, because it's got such a long, so it's not, you know, it's not chattering quite as much going across. And I feel sure that everybody out here knows what the term snipe means. And I'm not talking about that little bird they took you to hunt when you was in Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. Snipe is where a lot of times when you first start the planing and you exit the planer, it'll take a little bit off each end. What happens is the rollers, there's typically two, and it's when the board is only being supported by one roller until it gets under the second one, and particularly depending upon your bed, how much you got setting out here, that board's going to come along here and it's going to do this number. When it goes in and you let go of the board, then when it comes out, does the same thing. So there's two things you can do. The first thing is when you put the board in, hold the board up in the back until it gets into the second roller. Then support it on the other end the same way. As it comes out, hold it up. Helps immensely. Now you're going to see everybody out here tell you if your planer's tuned up and running perfectly and all of this, you're not going to get any snipe. Well, they know something I don't, because I've never been able to get one tuned up that you couldn't get a little bit of snipe on. The other thing I do on this big planer is I actually have the bed rollers all the way down. And what I do is I've been doing this forever. I wax the bed so the wood slides good. Now the wax I prefer, it's not cheap, but it's the Renaissance wax. And again, it's not cheap, but I found it, I use it on all my machines, and it works really, really well. It dries really fast. The other thing is that I've never had an issue with it transferring to my wood. I've never had a finish issue using it. That's a good point. The other thing with the big planers, when you're planing a board, if you look at most of them, you're going to see a crown to it. When it's kiln dried, a lot of times they cup some. You always want to plane with the crown up. That's your first pass. You want the high part, the crown, to be up. Now that said, one of the things with the big heavy planers is if you've got it set really tight, okay, meaning let's say for a moment you've got a board that's 4/4 and it's 1 1/16. If you set your planer at 1 1/16, odds are if you laid that piece of wood on something flat and measured from the surface to the top of the crown, it's going to be more than 1 1/16 because the wood is crowned up, it's cupped. So what happens when you put it through that big planer and those big heavy infeed rollers and whatever, you know what it's going to do? It's going to mash that crown flat and plane it. It's not going to remove it. Remember something, a planer will not, nor are they designed to straighten wood. They're designed to remove the surface, to plane it. So with that said, if you've got a crown in it, measure from the surface to the top of that crown. That's where you want to start. Because again, if you go much lower, then the rollers are going to mash it and plane it, and it's going to come out nice and smooth and beautifully planed, but it's still going to have that cup in it. Got that? Okay. This is that piece of flame birch we were looking at earlier. And it's about 1 inch, maybe a little bit over. So I'm going to start my planer at about 1 1/16. I see guys just hogging, and that's just not the way you plane wood. Take your time. You know, those light easier passes are going to do a whole lot better job than trying to hog it. Particularly when you get into the lunchbox planers. They're just not going to handle that kind of pressure. Now that is a skim plane. And particularly when you get into a figured wood or something like this, if your planer has variable speeds, go at the slowest feed rate. You'll also notice we have no snipe. Now this is ready just to leave and let it acclimate. But one of the things you're going to notice behind here is I've got most of my wood standing. I actually prefer to store it flat where I can. This is woods we're working with, so we're going to be moving through these. This is just kind of to get them off the floor and give us more room. Now we were talking about buying wood. If you look right here, this is what's called a log set. Now again, doing it professionally, I'm going to go through more wood than the average hobby guy. But when I can find these, that's what I want. What is a log set? It means it's the tree. So when I build a project out of it, all the wood's going to match. Particularly if you're using figured woods, like tiger maple. If you look at tiger maple, and even any figured wood that has a curl to it, you want to try to match the curl. In other words, you don't want a real fine curl mixed in with a broad curl and stuff like that. It really looks out of place. So a log set does that. If I'm buying cherry, walnut, they're getting hard to find and they are expensive. But that means that I've got the same color all the way through, or as close as possible. Okay? That's how we deal with wood. But one of the things that happens is this board we just planed, it was nice and straight and relatively flat. They don't always come that way. So then what do you do? Okay. Sometimes, no matter what you do, you're going to get wood's got a twist in it. Twist is when it's twisted. Now, I can hear everybody telling me, well, you don't buy that. Well, no, not intentionally, but a lot of times when you get in, again, particularly with figured woods, it's just inevitable. Again, when you get all this figure, you've got all these adverse grains in there. So when this stuff is kiln dried, that wood can twist. I mean, it doesn't matter how well they sticker it and whatever's done, it's just the nature of the wood. And so what you have to do is you have to learn to deal with that. In my world, it's rare that you get particularly a pretty good sized piece of tiger maple or flame birch or pretty much anything that you're not going to be dealing with some twists and some boards. The key is how to get it out. Now, the first thing is cut it into as short of pieces as possible. Meaning, if this piece of 8/4, let's say I'm going to cut 30-inch legs. Well, this piece is about 54 inches long. I'm going to cut it about 31 inches. I'm not going to try to cut to my exact dimension, but I'm going to cut it about 31 inches. The shorter it is, the less twist, easier it is to get out. But inevitably, it's going to happen. There's several ways you can do it. If you look up here, you can see there's a mark. Can you see it? Here's what I did. I got a piece of wood that fit under. Was it laying on a flat bench? It just fit under. And all I did was just drew down it. Went down it. This is going to show me what I have to take off. And then I obviously have to take it off on the reverse side. Now, I can do this with a hand plane, but you get into a piece of flame birch like this, which is really hard and dense, that's going to be really difficult. Now, I also want to emphasize to you that you want to do this before you plane anything. So then what I have to do is I have to take that hand plane and I have to start working. I did the same thing on the end. That's going to tell me how far over I got to go. I usually make a line here. In any case, what I do is then I just start planing this corner and that corner, check it until I've got it laying where it's not going to twist. But like I said, flame birch, some of these harder woods, that's a lot of work. My other alternative is a little power planer. Again, opposing corners. Probably on a long piece, the easiest way, a couple ways you can do this. Go to the bandsaw and saw you a long wedge. This is just a little piece of plywood. Glue it. I emphasize glue it. Glue it under. Now, you can just put a straight piece on here if you want, then just hand plane the little wedge you're adding until you've got the rock out. When it's no longer rocking, you're good to go. Now, the reason you want the long wedge is so when it goes through your planer, it's not going to drop. You understand? In other words, it's got to be able to roll through there on that bed pretty consistent. The other thing you can do is you can put this, if you don't want to do that, you can simply put a piece on this corner and the other corner, again, so it's not rocking. Then put this piece of wood on another piece of wood that's flat. And that's what's going to allow it to ride through, okay, and not drop on the rollers. If it's short, this is just a piece of MDF I grabbed to show you. You notice I've got a cleat on the end of it. This is pretty important because when you put it through that planer, if it's just sitting on top of a piece of wood, that planer, those knives are striking and it's pushing back at you. You want a cleat on here and you want this board tight up against it so that it can't push back. And let it all go through. And it will then flatten this top. Then, of course, once you've got the top flat, you can take it out, flip it over, and do the bottom. Now, we're going to go to the joiner just in a second. If you have a joiner, then you've got it made. But in this case, this piece is about 9 inches wide, a little over 8.5, 9 inches wide, and I only have an 8-inch joiner. Now, I'm fully aware there's kind of different techniques and things guys use out here to joint something like this that's wider than their planer. And I've had relative kind of success with it, but this is just so much quicker and sure. I've never had this fail me. Now I'm going to emphasize glue the strips on. If it's a long strip, you might get by with some double-faced tape, but just glue it on, a little CA glue or something like that does pretty well. Obviously, you don't want to nail them on. But the thing with the joiner deal is that you got to remove your guard, and you know, you're getting into all of this stuff, and then you've got to come back and add a shim, and it's just a lot of rigmarole to go through. This is just the way I do it, and I'm done. It gets it over and done with. Now, the other thing you have to consider is that you're going to be losing, in this case, this is almost 1/4 inch on each corner. So I'm going to lose, at least I'm going to lose 1/4 off of this corner and the other corner before I get down to this. Then when I flip it over, I'm going to lose another 1/4 on the back. So I'm going to lose a 1/2 inch in thickness on this. Okay, but again, cutting it to the shortest length that you need. If I was doing this and I was trying to get legs out of this piece, again, I would cut it, you know, I'm going to give myself some overage, and then I would rip it. But again, don't rip it to size, because as we rip it, it's going to drop. Okay, and that twist is going to become a whole lot less. And I'm going to lose a lot less material doing it that way. Now, you got to be careful when you're ripping something like this. And a little later, we'll be looking at a bandsaw. Bandsaw is a good way to rough cut something like this. Okay, be careful doing it. The other thing you can do is, if you've got a short piece, again, this we refer this as a planer dog. But what you can do is you can simply just lay your wood on here, and again, attach a shim under the opposing corners, and it's going to act as a joiner for you. But the cleat, I'm going to re-emphasize, the cleat is very, very important. All right, we'll come back and we're going to take a look at a joiner. Now my joiner is an 8-inch rule of thumb. Get the biggest and the widest joiner you can afford. That's simple. The wider pieces of wood you can handle, the longer material you can do. The key to a joiner, unlike a planer, is designed straighten wood. But again, it has to be correct. Real quick, you got an outfeed table, an infeed table. You set your infeed table to 0. You take a straight edge, you put across it. You want it straight. When you do that, you want to make sure your cutter head, that knife at the top point, is just touching the straight edge. That's going to keep you from getting snipe, just like on a planer. The second thing you want to do is you want to make sure that your joiner, with a good square, is set at 90 degrees. That's simple. If you have a piece of wood, and I don't know how well we're going to be able to show you this, but if you look at this, let me get the right side. Yeah, there we go. If you look at this, I'm pretty much square there, but I'm not down here, kind of all over the place. And this is just ripped out of a piece of twisted wood. But can you see that gap? So the key to a joiner is that you're going to keep one side tight to the fence and go across the cutters. That's going to create you a 90 degree on that. Now when I do this again, I want you to pay attention to the sound. This board has also got a bow in it. So the joiner is only hitting on the front and the back. That's correct. That's the way you want to do it. And every board will have a little bit. If you do it on the concave side, convex side, where it's up, then the joiner wants to track. Okay, it's a whole lot more difficult to get it straight when you're doing that. If you do it where it's touching on the points, and you'll see a whole lot more about that later, but that's the easiest way to get it straight. When you hear it hitting all the way down, you're going to know you've got it. Then if need be, joint your other side. The object of the joiner is to give you two parallel sides, 90-90. It's not that you can't use it as a planer to do the other sides, but it's not this at this point. Once I've got one side straight and the bottom straight, then it's time to go back and go through the planer to do the top, which is going to dimension it to an exact dimension. Then it's time to go to the table saw and rip it to a width. Understand? Joiner's straighten, planer's plane. My table saw. You know, my goodness. I've owned Sears contractor, Delta contractor, Unisaw, Powermatic 66. In my shop now I have a Jet, Exacta saw, and a saw stop. You know, they all did pretty good, but the bigger saws, definitely better. When Beesmeyer came out with the T-fence, they did excellent, and that really made a lot of difference because the fences were far more accurate. If you're going to see these little $119 job site table saws and whatever, I'm not going to tell you not to get one, but I wouldn't. And simply put, they're just not real accurate. And the other side to it, the fences on them are usually terrible. You know, if you got to measure from here, from one side to the back, and try to get the fence halfway straight, it's just more frustration than you can imagine. I'm not going to tell you to buy a saw stop, but I am going to tell you this: it's the best saw I've ever owned, and that's just a fact. Not to mention the safety factor of it. I don't need to mention that because it's out there everywhere. And if you want to start a fight, go out on the forum, start talking about a saw stop. But one of the things I will tell you, this is called a riving knife. And basically, then you've also got a splitter. Splitters usually just kind of come up behind. The riving knife comes over. And what this is about is when you're ripping wood, wood can open up, it can try to pinch. Now what this does is this keeps it from being able to pinch on the blade and kick back at you. That can be pretty interesting. That can be very dangerous. So, in my opinion, of anything on a table saw, you want a splitter or a riving knife. I mean, you can buy aftermarket ones that work. You want something to keep that blade from pinching. You know, I've been quoted as saying that the other thing is you just can't be too careful. I mean, the table saw is probably one of the most dangerous pieces of equipment you own or you'll use. And I've been quoted as saying that you may think you're faster and smarter than a table saw blade running 10,000 RPM, but you're not. Trust me, you're not. So be careful. Now, the other thing that I found, which you can't see, but right here at my knee is a paddle switch. You can buy them aftermarket. If you don't have that on your saw, it may be a good idea, because what happens, that quick, I'm off. I like to be able to turn these things off as quick as possible. But when I'm ripping wood, or whatever I'm doing, there's a couple things you need to think about. I've got an outfeed table. Now, for years and years, I didn't have a nice one with rollers. Mine was made out of plywood. But I made some legs that folded up under it, and it would just drop down in the front out of my way, but I made it go all the way across, because you don't want a piece of wood getting out there and you're trying to hold this piece of wood from dropping off the end. Not a good idea at all. The other thing you can do if you're in a small garage or whatever is you've got a workbench. Put casters on it. Casters, everything I got in my shop rolls. Locking casters, good ones. But make a bench the height of your table saw. And you can simply roll it up to it so that you got something to support your material coming off. The other thing that happens in a lot of shops, that are smaller, is where I was talking about that folding down in the front with the legs folded up. A lot of times your table saw becomes your workbench as well. You just don't have a lot of space. Well, having that table where it would fold down served two purposes. One, it gave me an outfeed. The second thing it did is it gave me a work table, and I could get it out of the way when I needed it. So it's all kind of different things you can do. But we're fortunate today, we've got a good outfeed table, and that means a lot, as well as a saw stop and a riving knife. But let's talk a little bit about blades. There's every kind of saw blade out there you can humanly think of. And we've used a lot of them, and there's a lot of really good ones. Personally, nowadays, Freud makes one. It's called the Freud Fusion. And you can't hardly see it on this one, but you'll see them. And in case this should answer your question, if you're wondering if you can use the Teflon coated blades on the saw stop, yeah, you can, not an issue. And I really like them. Now, the other blade I like, and I have several of, is the Forest. And I think Forest makes an excellent blade. There's just no doubt about it. But they get a little pricey. Sharpening your blades, you want to have them professionally done, and that's just the end of the story. Forest, you can send them back. I think Forest you can even send them to Freud's, but you want them professionally done. One of the things I see a lot of people have issues with, and if you look at this blade right here and this one, you're going to see a little bit of pitch and gum on the teeth. I need to clean that. And you're going to see pitch and gum remover and all of this stuff out there everywhere. Thanks to a good friend of mine, Pitbull, he introduced me to this crud cutter. We get it at Lowe's. A lot of the hardware stores have it and whatever. I don't know what's in it. Don't care. But I'm going to tell you what. It'll take the crud off of a saw blade, a router bit. And a little later we'll be looking at a drum sander. If you get a burn on the paper, it'll clean that, clean an oven. It'll just clean both anything. Tell you what it'll do too. It'll remove dried paint. If you're finishing and you're using water-based finish, and a little bit gets set up in your gun, it's the only thing I found you can soak your gun in, and it'll cut it loose without destroying the gaskets and whatever. Pitch and gum remover, crud cutter. We swear by it. Okay, if I'm doing a glue line rip, I typically keep two blades. I usually have a glue line rip, and it's just less teeth. You know, I'm not going to get a big speech about, you know, I think this is probably what, 28, 26 teeth, something like that. And then I use the combination. They do just fine. A little finer cut, but a glue line rip, because of the less teeth in it, it's a little bit more aggressive in the cut, and it's made just for that long rip. It gives a really nice finish and nice glue ups. But let's assume for a moment, we looked at a joiner, but let's assume for a moment you've got something long and big that you need a straight line, and you don't have a joiner. You know, I went for years and years, didn't have a joiner. I didn't have anywhere to put it, and if I couldn't afford it if I did. So here's what I came up with. Been doing it forever. I take a long straight edge. Now remember, on the joiner we were talking about every board typically has, the term is wane. It's not going to be perfectly straight. And as I look down this one, I can see this one's going just a little bit like this. So I'm going to turn it around to where I'm touching this piece of metal. Now, can you see this? See the gap in the middle? That's exactly what I want. Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to run this down this table saw with this against the fence, this against this edge. I'm going to be back here, and I'm just simply going to hold it and push it through. Which means I'm going to straighten one edge. For some of y'all, that might be a little dicey. I got used to doing it. I did it for so many years. That was the only way I had to straighten something. I just got used to doing it. Never had an issue. Now I can come back, do the other side. Now I'm going to tell you up front, no, I do not have the dust collection on this. I have it, I don't have it on. And that's just because it takes so long when we're filming to turn it on and off. That typically gives you a pretty straight edge. Now, if it's not, then index this side back to the fence and go through again. It'll usually get it it'll get it straight. All right, let's talk about fences a minute. I really got chastised because I made the statement that I like a long fence with a riving knife. Gives me more of an index surface. A lot of the guys who like the European saws, their contention was they wanted a short fence so that if this wood decided to open up, that the fence wouldn't prevent the board from doing that, and if it had a long fence, it would try to push it into the blade. Okay, your choice. I've never had that happen, but each to their own. I like a long fence. That's simple. Now, there's so many videos out there on fences and table saws and how to set them up and how to line them up. Main thing is to make sure is that you take the same tooth and you measure from your fence, go to the same tooth and go to the back and measure to the tooth and make sure you're exact. If not, adjust your fence until you're correct to it. Now, in the case of the saw stop, I see a lot of guys really get kind of freaked out if the miter slot doesn't line up perfectly with the blade in the fence. That's usually not a big deal. I mean, you can fiddle with it and try to get everything there, but again, it's not a huge deal. And the reason for it is because the miter slot and your miter gauge is going to be flexible to the point that all you got to do is adjust the miter slide to the fence, as long as it's square. But it is better because it's a whole lot better if you can get them in alignment, because otherwise what happens is in the long run of things, it can pull you just a little bit. So just be aware of that. And in a minute, I'm going to show you my crosscut sled and the value of it.